Look at Britain on a world map, and it appears almost insignificant, a small, rain-soaked group of islands hanging off the western edge of Europe. Yet by the early 20th century, Britain controlled roughly 1/4 of the world's land and population. Its territories were scattered so widely across the planet that somewhere, at every hour, the sun was shining on British-controlled soil. The empire had become too large for daylight to escape it. But how did islands repeatedly invaded by Romans, Saxons, Vikings and Normans become the center of the largest empire in history? The answer was not simply courage, superior ships or brilliant kings. Britain rose through a chaotic combination of geography, forced political unions, private corporations, piracy, national debt, coal, local collaborators and an extraordinary ability to transform disasters into institutions. Even stranger, at the beginning of this story, Britain did not exist at all. This is how several rival kingdoms became one island power, conquered territories across the world, and eventually watched almost everything disappear. Before we go any further, a quick note on names, because this matters. England, Britain, Great Britain and the United Kingdom are not the same thing and are not interchangeable. For most of this story, they did not exist yet. We will build them as we go. Around 410 CE, Roman authority over the islands began to collapse, not in one clean evacuation, but slowly, like a business quietly shutting down before anyone officially announces it. Imperial administration dissolved. Military protection disappeared. The economic networks that had connected these islands to the wider Mediterranean world simply stopped functioning. Local communities were left to organize their own defenses with whatever they had. There is even a famous imperial letter supposedly telling Britain to look after itself, though some historians have pointed out it may have actually referred to Bruttium, a region in southern Italy. Britain's post-Roman story might partially begin with a geographical misunderstanding in someone's correspondence. Which, honestly, is a very British way to start. What came next was not England. Not yet. The islands fragmented into a patchwork of British, Pictish, Irish and Anglo-Saxon territories. The Anglo-Saxon migration that followed was not one organized invasion with a clear start date. It was a long, messy process involving settlement, conflict, intermarriage and gradual cultural transformation across generations. England was not waiting fully assembled beneath the ruins of Roman Britain. It had to be built, slowly, out of chaos. And here is the first thing that surprises most people about this period. The so-called Dark Ages were not as dark as the name suggests. Take the burial site at Sutton Hoo in East Anglia, discovered in 1939 beneath a mound of earth. Inside was a ship burial containing Byzantine silver, Scandinavian-style weapons, and luxury objects connected to distant trade networks stretching across Europe and beyond. Britain had lost Roman government, but its wealthiest inhabitants had clearly not lost access to international shopping. The world was still connected. People just had to work harder to navigate it. Now, most people's mental image of the Vikings arriving in Britain involves the famous raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793. Dramatic, violent, historically significant. But here is the thing, that was not the first recorded encounter. Several years earlier, around 789, Viking ships appeared near Portland on the southern coast of England. A royal official rode down to meet them, apparently assuming they were merchants. He was killed. So the very first recorded Anglo-Viking encounter began with a catastrophically unsuccessful customs inspection. The tone for the next 2 centuries was set immediately. The Vikings that followed did not just raid and leave. They destroyed several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which had the unintended consequence of forcing the survivors to get organized. The Kingdom of Wessex, under pressure, developed stronger defenses, fortified towns, taxation systems and administrative structures. Alfred the Great, the one famous for allegedly burning some cakes while hiding from Viking forces, helped build those foundations. But he never ruled a fully unified England. That distinction usually goes to his grandson Æthelstan, who in the 10th century became the first monarch to control what we might reasonably call a united English kingdom. Invasion, it turned out, was an extremely effective political motivator. Not every response to the Viking problem was quite so constructive. In 1002, King Æthelred, history has given him the nickname, the Unready, which is a mistranslation but feels accurate, ordered the killing of Danes living inside his territory on St. Brice's Day. Rather than removing the threat, the massacre appears to have encouraged further Scandinavian retaliation. It was the medieval political option labeled, "Make everything significantly worse," and Æthelred selected it with confidence. His successor, the Danish King Cnut, is famous for a completely different reason. The story goes that he commanded the tide to stop rising and was embarrassed when the sea ignored him. What the original accounts actually describe is almost the opposite. Cnut was demonstrating to his courtiers that royal power had limits, that only God commanded the sea. Later storytellers converted an act of deliberate humility into a story about an arrogant king who believed he had ocean-controlling superpowers. Medieval propaganda worked in both directions. Then came 1066, the date that sits permanently in the memory of anyone who has ever taken a British history class. William of Normandy crossed the Channel, defeated King Harold at Hastings, and changed everything. But the conquest did not end at Hastings. Establishing control took years. During what historians call the harrying of the North, Norman forces systematically destroyed settlements, livestock and food supplies across northern England to crush resistance. William did not just win a battle. He replaced an entire ruling class, redistributed land on an enormous scale and introduced castles as permanent symbols of military occupation. The battle was the beginning. The transformation took a generation. And then, in 1120, one of the strangest and most consequential disasters in English history occurred on a single night. Henry I's only legitimate son was crossing the Channel on a ship called the White Ship. Along with much of the young English aristocracy, the ship sank. Nearly everyone aboard drowned. Henry was left without a male heir, and the succession crisis that followed produced a period of prolonged civil war between two rival claimants, Stephen and Empress Matilda, that historians call the Anarchy. Britain's most serious political crisis of the 12th century began with one of history's worst royal cruises. During that conflict, Matilda found herself besieged inside Oxford Castle in the winter of 1142. Later accounts claim she escaped across the frozen River Thames wearing white clothing that allowed her to blend into the snow. The dramatic details are disputed, but the underlying fact is real: she escaped, the war continued, and the question of who got to sit on the English throne remained dangerously unresolved for years. That question of royal power versus other forms of authority kept resurfacing. In 1215, a group of rebellious barons forced King John to agree to Magna Carta, a charter limiting royal authority and establishing certain legal rights. It sounds like the founding moment of British democracy. Here is what actually happened: John signed it, then immediately appealed to Pope Innocent III, who annulled the charter just over 2 months later. Magna Carta failed almost immediately as a peace settlement, contributed to another civil war and only survived because later rulers reissued it under different political circumstances. The document that became a symbol of liberty spent most of its early life being ignored, cancelled, or rewritten. A century later, the Black Death arrived and killed somewhere between a third and half of England's population. The sheer scale of the loss accidentally strengthened the survivors. Labor became scarce. Workers who remained alive could demand higher wages and better conditions. The government's response was to pass laws attempting to freeze wages and prevent workers from moving to better employment. The authorities survived one of history's worst pandemics and immediately became concerned that surviving peasants were negotiating too confidently. That tension exploded in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt. What is often overlooked is what the rebels specifically targeted. They did not only attack castles and noble households. They deliberately destroyed tax records, legal documents and manorial rolls, the paperwork that recorded debts, labor obligations, and the legal conditions of serfdom. They understood that power was stored not only inside fortified walls, but inside filing systems. They were attacking the medieval database. The Wars of the Roses followed in the 15th century, a name that conjures two perfectly organized teams, one red, one white, fighting a clean and continuous war. The reality was considerably messier. Alliances shifted. Noble families switched sides. The same people who fought for one house ended up supporting the other. The simplified symbolism of red and white roses became more important in later storytelling than it ever was during the actual conflict. Medieval politics operated less like chess and more like a family argument in which everyone happened to own a private army. The conflict ended in 1485 when Richard III died at the Battle of Bosworth. Tudor propaganda then spent decades converting him into one of history's great theatrical villains, a scheming, physically deformed tyrant. In 2012, archaeologists discovered his remains beneath a car park in Leicester. The skeleton confirmed scoliosis but did not support every physical deformity the Tudor storytellers had attached to him. Richard III lost a kingdom, and eventually gained a parking space. The Tudors who replaced him transformed England in ways that went far beyond palace intrigue. Henry VIII's 6 marriages are the part most people remember: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, but the marriages were almost a distraction from the real revolution. When Henry broke with Rome and dissolved the monasteries, he transferred an enormous quantity of land and institutional wealth from the church to the crown and to private landowners. Hundreds of religious houses were closed. The social and economic geography of England was permanently rearranged. The wives were the headline. The property redistribution was the story. Under the Tudors, Wales was formally incorporated into the English legal and parliamentary system. Political unity arrived, but with cultural conditions attached, English became the required language of government, which meant Welsh speakers were effectively excluded from public office unless they abandoned their own language. Union came with a price that was paid by the people being unified. Meanwhile, Elizabeth I's government was quietly building something that would become a model for future empires, a surveillance network. Her spymaster Francis Walsingham used informants, intercepted correspondence, and skilled codebreakers to monitor threats to the crown. Mary, Queen of Scots, used multiple cipher systems to communicate secretly with her supporters. Walsingham's team intercepted and decoded those messages, and her encrypted letters became the evidence used against her at trial. The lesson was clear: the people who control information control outcomes. Guy Fawkes did not control the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. He was responsible for guarding and igniting the explosives. The actual organizer was Robert Catesby. Fawkes became the famous face of the conspiracy largely because he was the one caught in the cellar. The source of the anonymous letter that warned authorities remains uncertain. The original cellar was destroyed in the 19th century. And Parliament still conducts a ceremonial search of its own basement before the state opening, a tradition that began as a genuine security measure and has continued ever since, because once a tradition exists in Britain, removing it requires more political effort than almost anything else. The 17th century brought a conflict that made the Gunpowder Plot look relatively minor. The English Civil War pitted Parliament against the Crown, and Parliament won. Charles I was executed in 1649, the first time in English history that a reigning monarch was publicly tried and beheaded. On the cold morning of the execution, Charles reportedly wore an extra shirt so that shivering in the January air would not be mistaken for fear. Even while losing his throne and his head, the king remained deeply concerned about public relations. The republic that followed was led by Oliver Cromwell, and it did things that are still remembered with a particular kind of disbelief. Puritan authorities abolished traditional Christmas celebrations. Soldiers disrupted church services. Festive food was confiscated. There were protests and riots in several towns. England was simultaneously fighting a war over the nature of government, the limits of royal authority, and the question of religious practice, and whether anyone was permitted to enjoy December. Now, here is a good moment to clarify something that confuses almost everyone. The political construction of what we now call the United Kingdom happened in stages, and none of those stages were inevitable, peaceful, or particularly logical. England gradually unified during the Anglo-Saxon and Viking periods. Wales was conquered and incorporated into the English legal system under the Tudors. In 1603, England and Scotland received the same monarch. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, but they remained entirely separate countries with separate parliaments. The Acts of Union in 1707 created the Kingdom of Great Britain. Ireland entered the Union in 1801. Most of Ireland later left. The geographical and political construction of the modern United Kingdom took roughly 1200 years and involved conquest, financial pressure, religious conflict, and at least one catastrophic colonial failure. That colonial failure is one of the more remarkable stories in British history, and it directly caused the 1707 Union. In 1698, Scotland attempted to establish its own commercial empire by planting a colony on the Isthmus of Panama, a place called Darien. 5 ships set sail from Scotland loaded with 1,200 colonists, a year's supply of food, and trading commodities including 25,000 pairs of leather shoes. The plan was to create a trading hub connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The reality was disease, hostile Spanish forces, inadequate supplies, and almost total collapse. The failure cost around 2,000 lives and wiped out roughly a quarter of Scotland's available liquid capital. The Company of Scotland that financed the scheme was backed by around a fifth of the money in circulation in Scotland, and its collapse devastated the Scottish lowland economy, contributing directly to the Act of Union that followed in 1707. Scotland did not join Britain because the idea was irresistible. It joined because Panama had been a disaster. The 1688 Glorious Revolution deserves a similar reality check. William of Orange arrived in England with a large fleet and a multinational army after being invited by English political elites who were unhappy with James II. England later remembered this as a relatively bloodless constitutional revolution. The wars that followed in Ireland and Scotland were considerably less bloodless. The revolution was real, but the glorious part depended heavily on which part of the islands you were standing in. What the revolution did produce was a more stable relationship between the Crown and Parliament, and that stability made possible something that would prove more powerful than any army. Britain developed a financial system that allowed it to borrow money at scale, fund long wars and maintain naval forces across multiple oceans simultaneously. The Bank of England was established in 1694. Government bonds, tax systems and financial markets allowed Britain to keep fighting long after its immediate resources should have run out. Britain discovered that an empire did not always need to be paid for immediately. And before the government formally arrived in many parts of the world, the shareholders arrived first. The East India Company is the most striking example. It began as a trading enterprise and gradually accumulated the powers of a government, collecting taxes, negotiating treaties, maintaining armies and controlling territory across large parts of South Asia. Parts of the British Empire did not begin as colonies in any conventional sense. They began as commercial projects operated by corporations with government protection and shareholder expectations. The empire was, in significant part, a business arrangement that got out of hand. In 1776, 13 American colonies declared independence, and Britain lost them. It was a major humiliation. Britain reviewed the situation and responded by expanding almost everywhere else. India, Southeast Asia, Africa, Australia, the Pacific, the loss of one empire accelerated the construction of another. The direction changed. The momentum did not. What powered that expansion, more than anything else, was what was happening at home. Coal, steam engines, factories, railways, iron production and modern shipbuilding transformed Britain's economic and military reach during the late 18th and 19th centuries. The Industrial Revolution was not just a domestic story. It was the engine of empire. The territories Britain controlled were not maintained by flags and speeches alone. They were maintained by coal, steel, credit, shipping schedules and an enormous quantity of paperwork. And this brings us to the central image of the whole story. By the early 20th century, British-controlled territories covered roughly 1/4 of the world's land surface and contained a similar proportion of its population. Canada, large areas of the Caribbean, vast stretches of Africa, India, Australia, strategic ports and islands scattered across every ocean. The territories occupied so many time zones that daylight was always present somewhere within the empire. The sun never set on the British Empire, and that phrase, which started as a boast, eventually became one of the most accurate geographical statements in history. But here is the central contradiction that the boast concealed. An empire that large could not be controlled by British people alone. It relied on colonial soldiers, local administrators, indigenous collaborators, commercial elites and existing networks of authority that Britain managed rather than replaced. A relatively small island power controlled enormous territories by working with, and frequently through, the people who already lived there. The empire was built on collaboration as much as conquest, and that collaboration came at a cost that was paid almost entirely by the people doing the collaborating. One of the starkest illustrations of that cost came with abolition. When slavery was formally abolished across most of the British Empire in 1833, the British government paid approximately £20 million. In compensation, that money went to slave owners. The people who had been enslaved received nothing, and were initially placed into a compulsory apprenticeship system that extended their unpaid labor for years. The moral case for abolition was real. The financial settlement that accompanied it revealed exactly whose interests the system had been designed to protect. At home, the machinery of government was also proving surprisingly fragile. In 1834, workers attempted to dispose of old wooden tally sticks, an obsolete accounting system, by burning them in furnaces beneath the Houses of Parliament. The fire spread, and much of the old palace of Westminster burned to the ground. The center of British government was destroyed by outdated bookkeeping. The building that replaced it, with its famous clock tower and Gothic facade, is the one that people now picture when they think of British democracy. It was built because someone could not figure out a better way to get rid of old sticks. A few decades later, in the summer of 1858, the Thames in London became so polluted and so overwhelmingly foul-smelling that Parliament could not function properly. The event became known as the Great Stink. The result was major investment in modern sewers and urban infrastructure. For years, the pollution had harmed ordinary Londoners without producing significant political action. Change came quickly once politicians could personally smell the problem. Britain entered the First World War with more than soldiers and ships. It entered with codebreakers. Room 40, the Naval Intelligence Division, decoded the Zimmermann telegram in 1917, Germany's proposal for a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. The decoded message was passed to the American government and contributed to the United States entering the war. British ships, meanwhile, were painted in bold geometric patterns of black, white and color, a technique called Dazzle camouflage. The objective was not to hide the ships. It was to make their speed and direction difficult for submarine commanders to calculate accurately. The Royal Navy was not hiding. It was confusing. Between the wars, the modern United Kingdom was still being geographically defined. After the partition of Ireland in the early 1920s, a boundary commission was established to consider possible territorial adjustments to the new border. Its recommendations disappointed most of the competing parties, and after details leaked to the press, the governments agreed to leave the existing border in place. The border that exists today, the one that has generated political controversy for a century, was partly the result of a leak. The Second World War produced one of the strangest verified intelligence operations in history. British intelligence placed fake documents on the corpse of a man disguised as a Royal Marines officer and released the body off the Spanish coast. The body was that of a 34-year-old Welsh man named GlynDWR Michael, who had died in London. He was dressed as a Royal Marines major with the false identity of William Martin, given appropriate identification documents, and equipped with personal items including a photograph of a fiancé and a receipt for an engagement ring. The operation convinced German intelligence that the Allies were planning a massive operation in Greece and Sardinia, when in reality they were preparing to attack Sicily. The Allied invasion of Sicily launched on July 9, 1943 proved a huge surprise to the German defenders, and the island was captured in just over a month. Britain won a major campaign with a dead man, a briefcase and a very convincing love life. Britain emerged from the Second World War on the winning side, exhausted and nearly bankrupt. It still possessed the language and symbols of a global superpower. It increasingly lacked the resources to remain one. The empire, which had seemed permanent for a generation, began to dissolve with remarkable speed. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947. African and Caribbean territories followed across the 1950s and 1960s. What had taken centuries to build was dismantled in decades. The moment that made the new reality undeniable came in 1956. Britain, France and Israel secretly coordinated military action against Egypt over control of the Suez Canal, while Britain and France publicly presented themselves as neutral peacekeepers intervening in a conflict. American and international pressure forced their withdrawal. Britain entered Suez believing it was still the 19th century. The rest of the world declined to participate in the reenactment. And yet the empire's disappearance from political maps was not the end of the story. The English language, common law, parliamentary systems, financial institutions, international organizations, trade networks and cultural exports continued to shape the world long after the flags came down. The borders Britain drew, often with minimal regard for the people living within them, became the borders of independent nations. The institutions Britain built became the institutions those nations inherited. The empire largely disappeared. Many of its consequences did not. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying this, drop a comment below telling us which part of this story surprised you most. And if you want to keep going, we have a video on the full history of the British Empire's expansion that picks up exactly where this is heading. It is worth watching. Here is one final detail that feels almost too strange to be real, but is documented. In 1983, British officials drafted a speech for Queen Elizabeth II to deliver in the event of nuclear war, a prepared address for a crisis that everyone hoped would never happen. And every British Prime Minister, upon taking office, writes sealed letters of last resort, instructions for the commanders of nuclear submarines, to be opened only if the government has been destroyed and communication has broken down. The letters are kept on board. Their contents are never revealed. When a new Prime Minister takes office, the old letters are destroyed unopened. Britain is a country that still prepares, quietly and formally, for the end of itself. Britain was never created according to one grand design. It emerged from Roman collapse, Viking invasion, Norman conquest, royal shipwrecks, forced political unions, religious seizures, private corporations, colonial armies, national debt, industrial accidents and secret agreements. A small group of islands became the center of an empire so geographically widespread that the sun was always shining somewhere within it. Then, in little more than a generation, most of that empire disappeared. But the systems, borders, languages, institutions and conflicts it created never completely vanished. Britain's greatest historical achievement may not have been building the world's largest empire. It may have been surviving 16 centuries of chaos, and presenting the final result as though everything had gone according to plan.